Thumbs up there. Right? Good evening.
Good evening.
We'll do short Holy Crosses. Oh Lord, save thy people and bless thine inheritance. Grant victories to the Orthodox Christians over their adversaries, and by virtue of thy cross, preserve thy habitation. Glory to Jesus Christ. One of my fears as a speaker is forgetting lines, and we just saw it tonight. Okay.
Oh no, it was like when they stopped the concert so that everyone else
Good spirit. Well, I appreciate being invited here this evening, and I hope you enjoy. I'm not as tall as Tom Cruise. I mean, I'm taller than Tom Cruise. I found that out. So. But I'm not, just look like. My name is Father David Smith, and as Father Ignatius pointed out, I'm the priest in charge at the Chapel of the Holy Spirit. I'm actually your missionary priest. I came out of this congregation, though I had a Lutheran church, but I actually came out of this congregation under the ministry of Father John Reeves, now in Blessed Virgin. Some of you may or may not know. So it's a joy to be able to be asked to be here. I hope that I can provide you some insight as to the craziness that I experienced as I was making my journey towards Orthodoxy. It was the capstone of a lifetime of searching. Really, it comes right down to it. It's a capstone. But before I get really into my story, I really like to know your names, because I don't know. I know this young man here and this young lady back here and this young lady here, but I don't know the rest of you. So if you can kind of give me your names, I would appreciate that, and what your rank is, your serial number, that kind of thing. Let's start back there.
I'm Anya. I'm the event planner for the chapter. I'm a second-year master's student studying speech-language pathology.
Oh, cool. And it's Anya, you said?
Yes.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I am Elias, and I'm a fourth-year senior. I'm studying
Okay, very good. Eli, correct? Okay. Good to meet you. Yanni. Okay, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah.
I'm really tell you, I'm really bad with pronunciations of names that are not Smith, Brown, Miller. Okay, so which you're not going to find too many in the Orthodox world yet. Okay, go ahead.
Alex.
Hi, Alex. And you're obviously an OCF student. You're at Penn State. Okay. What's your major? Business management. Okay. And you're what year?
Senior.
Okay. Very good. So you graduate this year.
Yeah.
All right. Well done.
I'm Eli. I'm just investigating Orthodoxy. I'm not actually
Okay.
officially here.
Great. Fantastic. Do you so I'm assuming because you're OCFers that all Orthodox background. So what is your background?
I'd say like traditional reform, pretty much.
Traditional reform, you said? Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're talking Presbyterian, we're talking, okay. All right, gotcha. Okay. Orthodox Presbyterian? There is Orthodox Presbyterian?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay.
But yeah, I've been investigating Orthodoxy for a while now, more seriously recently.
Good.
Good.
How long have you been looking?
I've only been attending here like regularly for a couple weeks now.
Okay.
I've been in and out for years actually.
What's your attraction? What's the attraction of Orthodox?
Initially, it was because I had a friend that was going here.
Hey, that's how Jesus did it.
I don't know the switchers very well, but I was coerced by them initially. Yeah, that's one word for it. But so initially it was that. Afterwards, I would say I'm just interested in theology, so I've studied all kinds of stuff like that. It's
Okay.
interesting.
Are you currently at Penn State?
In a matter of speaking, I'm a freshman, but I haven't started attending yet because I deferred my first semester.
Okay.
So I'll start this
All right, that's fair. Okay. This young man, go ahead.
I'm Callum.
Callum?
Callum, yes. I am super senior last semester studying economics. I'm also exploring orthodoxy,
Okay.
but my background is atheist.
Okay, all right.
So,
Very good, thank you, thanks for coming. How long have you been coming to the church here? Or haven't, you just got started?
sometime last semester, I
Okay.
was friends with the age who used to be here.
Oh,
He's
okay.
our former president.
Okay, right, okay, yeah.
So it was also
Okay, very good, excellent, excellent. And you, young lady?
I am Sophia Welch. I am a PhD student. I'm president of the OCF, and I have been Orthodox for.
What did you come out?
PCOS.
Oh, okay. Was that what you came out of, PCOC?
I don't think it's.
PCA, right?
Okay, PC, okay.
You know.
I know I've done. Yeah, because I was shopping around. Not hard to find.
The rest of you were all kind of cradle Orthodox? Okay, great, okay. Does everyone know what I mean when I say cradle, right? You were born and bred, okay, that kind of thing, right? All right, so it's kind of cradle, convert kind of thing. There is one writer that I cannot recall who said this, that technically everyone's a convert to Orthodoxy. There are really no cradle Christians. So everyone has to make a conversion of some sort. Okay. Over here is my lovely wife, Matushka Brenda. She's been with me on this journey for a long time. We've been married 42 years. I can say that I could not be on this journey, could not get on this journey without her. So I give God thanks for that and give him all the glory that he brought her into my life so we could be on this journey together. And she doesn't get near the recognition that she deserves and is warranted for her part in bringing us into Orthodoxy and making the chapel a real possibility. Richard is familiar with the chapel. He was just telling me that he was the treasurer at the time that we were kind of coming together. So, right. All right. So the kind of the sense that I was getting when Father Ignatius invited me was like they really wondered why you wanted to be Orthodox. You know, that kind of a thing. Is that kind of an accurate feeling that I was getting? You know, why would I? Is that because, why is that? If you're wondering to yourself, why would you want to be Orthodox? What's behind that question? To say, why would you want to be Orthodox? As though, what's my other choice?
Like, Orthodoxy is very different.
I'm sorry?
Orthodoxy is very different compared to, I guess if you want to put it, low churches.
Very different.
So like,
It's not like, you know, you were a Lutheran pastor, and so it isn't like, for typical Protestants, it's, oh, I'm going to this church, I'm going to this church, unless you really understand the theology behind your own church, there's not really that big of a difference, but in theory, you really understood the theology that you were preaching, and so
In theory.
what was it?
Well, yeah. And I'm going to be honest that when I tell my story, and I don't tell it often, but when I do get a chance to talk to people, and it's always fun to talk to other converts, other persons, because everyone is attracted to Orthodoxy for various reasons. Orthodoxy is like this multifaceted jewel. Multifaceted. That there's so many faces on this jewel, the way you look at it, there's a different light that kind of bounces off the face of this jewel. And that's for me how Orthodoxy has always been. And I think when I talk with other converts, it's always fascinating to hear what attracted you, what brought you in, you know. But when you really start getting a bunch of converts together, you hear the various things, but then we begin to come down to some really common things that are really associated with many converts that are really attracted to Orthodoxy. And it's not necessarily any one thing, but there are commonly shared things with converts. I wasn't always a Lutheran, okay? As I said to you, my journey was a capstone of my search. I was baptized as a Lutheran in my parents' church, and like many mainline, does everyone know what I mean when I say mainline churches? Do you know what that means? Mainline churches actually gets the name from the main line in Philadelphia. And it's an old term. And it used to be all of these churches that would line the main line in Philadelphia: Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Lutheran, these really big denominations in the United States that really made their way into the country. They became known as mainline churches. They were kind of the old steady churches at one time. And there was a time when mainline churches held to a very historic faith, but that's no longer the case. So I was part of this Lutheran church as a baby, but like so many mainline parents, my parents basically were Christmas and Easter, if we were lucky. My sister was confirmed, which is chrismation in our terminology. My sister was confirmed, and like so many confirmed mans, she immediately left the church. You know, it's like, you work your way up to get confirmed and then you leave. You know, don't understand that. But anyway, but I do remember some of my earliest memories as a kid, believe it or not, are of the Lutheran church. It was an old, not an old, but a brick colonial style church, if you know what I mean by that. Okay, colonial style. I had nice white pews with brown trim, and it's just, and there are certain smells that will trigger those memories for me. And I must have been maybe 5, 6, maybe 7 years old. So I wasn't real old, you know. And I had one really memory that stays with me, is I remember an older gentleman, kind of like a behind me in the pew, and I had the pew book, the hymnal, and I'm trying to find my way in the service because, you know, Lutherans are liturgical preachers, right? And you have to have a book to follow along. If you don't have the book, you're kind of lost. But liturgical preachers, and I was trying to find my way, and he was over my back, pointing to where I needed to be in the service. That's one of my earlier memories. I remember Sunday school to some degree, and I remember getting these nice little tickets, red tickets that looked like you were going on a ride of some sort at the amusement park, that you would get enough of those and then you could get a Bible or something like that if you had enough of it. So, and you're shaking your head, so you must have had some similar kind of experience. The mainline churches are kind of share kind of the similarities in that regard. But mainline churches are also on their way out, and so that's part of my story. So I was baptized, was never really brought up in the Lutheran church. I remember 10 years old, a pastor, we called them preachers in those days, was making his rounds in the community, and I lived out in the country in the middle of nowhere. And I remember he came to my friend's house, we were outside playing, and he said, "Hey, you want to go to church?" And for some odd reason, I said, "Sure, I'll go to church." I don't know why I said that. The Holy Spirit knows why. But I don't know why I said that. So I ended up in a Wesleyan church. If anyone knows about the Wesleyans and the Pilgrim Holiness churches and stuff, they're really ultra-conservative kinds of churches in the Protestant world. Became a Wesleyan, went off to Bible college in Allentown, because at 11 years old I had a strong call to ministry. And I remember playing pastor, preacher, as a kid in our attic. We had a nice 3-story house with a full attic, and so I could play up there. And I remember holding services up there and doing preacher things, pastor things, you know. But I had this strong call to be a pastor. So I went off to Bible college in Allentown, Wesleyan College. It is now defunct. It's part of the Houghton University, I think it is, in New York State, so they kind of folded it into it. That was in 1976. I went to, now you know where I am. I went in 1976 to Bible college after graduating from high school. Graduated from Bible school in Bible college in 1980. Went to Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmer, Kentucky, not too far from Lexington, if you're familiar with Kentucky. Graduated from there in 1983. In between, I became a Free Methodist. So I went from the Wesleyan Church to the Free Methodist Church. Same theological tradition. If you've ever heard of the Wesleyan Arminian tradition, same theological tradition, just for whatever reasons, as is with Protestantism, just a different take on some things. And so that's enough to create a whole new denomination. Okay? So there are approximately 30 to 40,000 variations of Protestants in this country. Think about that. 30 to 40,000 variations of this is what the Bible teaches, this is what Jesus said, and understandings. And so you can kind of get a sense as to why there's a kind of confusion in our land and amongst people to some degree. Became then, I was a Free Methodist, served in a parish for 2 years, at which time I rediscovered Martin Luther. Now, when I say rediscovered, it's because in college, I was having a spiritual crisis. I was struggling with who I am, who I know I am as a sinful human being. And the John Wesley's followers of Methodism fame, okay, United Methodist is also a mainline church. I felt that they didn't understand me, and Luther understood me. You can be a sinner and saint at the same time, is how he would put it. There's a Latin phrase for it, which I won't regale about. And so I also became attracted by the liturgy of the Lutheran Church. Deep down inside, I discovered, though I came out of these free traditions of Protestantism where you show up for church and you do, and there's no understanding of a liturgical life, there's no special days. In fact, I was trying to remember, I'm not even sure that we knew Easter was coming until the one day the pastor announced it's Easter and was saying Christ is risen from the dead and whatnot. There was no lead up, no preparation for it. You just kind of showed up and it's Easter. You show up and it's Christmas. Okay. So I came out with these free traditions, and then finally was really attracted by the Lutheran liturgy, which is a liturgy of the Western Church. So if you've ever been to a Roman Catholic Mass, you have some inkling as to what we were doing as Lutherans. Okay. So I decided that Luther understood me. I liked the liturgy. In fact, I love the liturgy. I was in love with that, and fell in love with the church. And so I made overtures to the Lutheran Church in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is where their headquarters was located. And they received me, and I went off to seminary yet again. I had to do what was called a Lutheran year of orientation, which actually turns into 3.5 years. Okay. So how they understand Lutheran year is a lot different than how I understand it. And then served my first parish in Penn, Pennsylvania, which is north of Bethlehem and south of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. So it's on the eastern side of PA. Was there for 9.5 years, which was a long time for your first parish in the Lutheran setting. The average lifespan of a first parish pastor was 3 years. I lasted 9.5 years. And in fact, I love that parish so much that we call that our home. So when our kids talk about home, we're talking about Penn most of the time. Left that parish, went to my second parish in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, which is down near Harrisburg, Camp Hill. Holy Apostles in Mechanicsburg, okay, you're familiar with that. So I served there we were there from 97 to 2003. And I was ordained as a Lutheran pastor in 1988. Okay. And then went to my third parish where I currently live. So where I live now is where I last served as a Lutheran pastor and have planted a mission of the Orthodox Church, literally a mile down the road from that church. And we were there from 2003 to end of 2007. So 4 years. So, what drew me to the Orthodox Church? Well, in 1997, as I was at Dillsburg, I was, for whatever reasons, the handwriting on the wall in the mainline church had become very clear to me. And what I mean by that is that you could see that the old mainline churches that used to retain a very historic faith, I mean, we're talking about creeds, and they actually took theology and the scriptures seriously, the moral teachings of the church seriously. I could see that was shifting rapidly, and of course, as what happens in so many Protestant churches, there's these these conferences are held and things are being said, and there are people saying, well, for you persons who are conservative, there will always be a place at the table for you. But you always knew that there might be a place at the table, but they weren't going to let you really see things differently unless it's their way. The moral crisis of the country was coming to light in the church for me. And so I began in 1997, and it took me 10 years to move from there to Orthodoxy. So it wasn't like I did this overnight. Okay? I explored things very, very carefully and deeply. So I began to look at the church and church history. Because in Protestantism, real church history is the time of Jesus and the apostles. John the theologian dies, and then there's this kind of this interlude until Martin Luther comes along and gets it right. Of course, in the meantime, you have 1,500 years. Church is thriving, church is living, the church is creating disciples and apostles, sending out missionaries. People are dying for the faith, and yet that gets kind of overlooked. It's not taken seriously because the mindset is that's when the church kind of fell and became corrupt under Rome, and because the Protestant issue is a Roman issue, and it's a cat fight between those persons of that mindset. And you know what happens in cat fights, okay? So that's what happens. So I began to go back to church history and I'm looking at this first 1,500 years. I'm starting to really, now remember, I've been to Bible college, I've been to one seminary, and I've been to a second seminary. So I've looked at church history, but we really never looked at the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church is the greatest secret hidden in America. The Orthodox Church is one of those churches that, because it is different, gets overlooked, or it gets a footnote, maybe a passing glance. I remember when I lived in Allentown, if you've ever been to Allentown in Bethlehem, there are a lot of Orthodox churches in that area. I remember seeing the onion domes, okay? And I remember being in one time. And so I was always close to Orthodoxy, but never really thought about it. You know what I mean? So looking back at church history, the first 1,500 years, it got me thinking, looking, because I began to think to myself, well, I can't go any further back in church history than the Roman Church or the Eastern Church. Can't do it. To go any further back, you got to be Jewish, okay? Because we come out of that, all right? So I got to looking at that and I think, well, Rome has 7 sacraments, Orthodox has 7 sacraments. There's priests, deacons, there's bishops. Over here, there's priests, deacons, and bishops. So why is it that we don't have that? What happened in church history? And so as I began to look at that a little more in depth and seriously, just kind of, and I had Lutheran colleagues. We were doing the same thing. I was part of a ministerium nationally that our main purpose was to regain what we understood to be the classical role of the minister in the ministry, which means that you have a spiritual life. It wasn't until my first parish that I really gave myself permission that it's okay to pray as a pastor. That it's not part of my job, but it's what I got to do if I want to be a Christian, if I want to survive. Because so much coming up through the educational system, and it is an educational academic experience. It's more of preparing you for a role of some sort, rather than be a spiritual person, a shepherd, that is infused with the life of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So I started looking at church history, as I said. I started looking at the moral teachings of the church, and doing a lot of questioning. And I have to be honest that I really toyed over here with going to Rome, because Rome would have been the easy choice. Why? Because it's the Western liturgy, it's the liturgy I know. Okay? But there's just things about Rome that just didn't sit well with me. And it wasn't just because I'm a Lutheran. I discovered that Orthodox had some of the same issues with Rome. Okay? So again, I'm looking deeper. How's the church been governed over the centuries? who's the leader of the church and whatnot. Looking at the arguments between Roman and Orthodox, and kind of feasting on that. Somewhere along the line, I sent out an email in one of the responses to the Antiochian website. Lo and behold, who called me one day at my rectory was Father Peter Gilchrist of blessed memory. And I don't know if you know Father Peter, but he himself had been a Lutheran at one time and became kind of a Protestant, a generic Protestant. He spent about 2 hours with me on the phone, and then he sent me a whole bunch of books to read. But he spent about 2 hours on the phone with me, just answering my questions and whatnot. I had a clergy colleague from the Lutheran Church who became an Orthodox priest. So he told me, he said, just come home. Well, that was easier said than done because, I'm a Lutheran pastor, And so my hope, my goal was, if I can just make it to retirement, then maybe I can convert, do something different, and that was kind of my goal. But again, 97 to 2003, I'm looking at all of this, and we moved then to Beavertown. And Father Gilquist's assistant put me in touch with Father John Reeves. And we struck up a relationship and just really enjoyed each other's company. He did a lot of evangelism over beer and pizza. We spent a lot of time drinking beer and pizza. He himself had been a Lutheran as a child, and then was an Episcopalian priest when he converted. And so it was just interesting how the Lord was bringing me into the lives of people who were converts. So they were asking the questions, I had to ask questions that I was asking, that are just normal for those of us who are exploring this weird entity called the Orthodox Church. I still wasn't necessarily convinced that I could be an Orthodox Christian because it just seemed to be so complicated. Now, I was doing this. I was coming up to this church on Saturday evenings for Vespers because as Lutherans, we didn't really have church outside of Wednesdays during Advent and Lent, and then Sundays. We didn't have Saturday night services and stuff like that. So I spent a lot of time with Father John, my wife, because she was getting a little suspicious as this man I was hanging out with. I was really just exploring this on my own. I wasn't even drawing her into the equation yet. I was just kind of looking at this. Is this what I can do? And all the more as I was looking at Orthodoxy, and it was really feeding me, I thought, well, maybe there's a Western version of Orthodoxy. And lo and behold, I discovered there is. There's a Western rite in the Antiochian Church and in Rokor. I don't know if Rokor still promotes it or not, but they have Western rite parishes. And I really thought, well, maybe I could do that. But that wasn't speaking to my heart. And so I kept coming up here and listening to the liturgy, listening to the hymnody of the Orthodox Church. It was like, wow, this is really moving. And the attitude of the people is prayerful. There's this respect for the clergy, bishop. And again, these are all things that are found in early church writings, which again, Protestant seminaries do not teach unless you take it as an extracurricular kind of course of some sort. Okay? It's not part of the standard curriculum. And so I began picking up these early church fathers and reading them. Wow, this is good stuff, But so as I was doing that, I became more and more formed by them. So in a sense, I was becoming Orthodox before I became Orthodox. Okay? Orthodoxy, and I think this is common to many converts, draws you into her. But there are things also that are very different about Orthodoxy in that we have to give ourselves to her, and to the church, to Christ. Because this whole search is for Jesus Christ. And in fact, when Lutheran colleagues of mine say to me, and I had a number of colleagues in this ministerium I was telling you about, who actually converted to Rome rather than coming to East, to Constantinople. It was for them the easier transition. But in talking with them, they would say, well, why'd you go to Orthodoxy? And quite honestly, I tell you, it was because of the truth. The truth is what drove me, compels me. If it's not the truth, then what's the point? And in fact, that's what Father John told me. He says, if you are coming to Orthodoxy for any other reason, because it's got great liturgy, or whatever, he says, forget it. Don't do it. But if it's the truth, then it's worth everything. And remember the parable of our Lord, of the pearl of great price, the treasure hidden in the field. And what does the merchant who buys the pearl, what does he do? He sells everything. So he can get this one pearl of great price. And what's the person who finds the treasure hidden in the field? He buys up the field so that he can have this valuable, priceless treasure. For me, that's what Orthodoxy had become. And so it was because it's the truth, which I was finding in the mainline churches was always up for sale to the highest bidder or to the latest cultural fad. Because it wants to be so much accepted that it's almost willing to do sell its soul for a pot of pottage, like Esau did, in order to get what it wants. But it's all about Jesus Christ. And yeah, Luther was big on Jesus Christ, don't get me wrong. I mean, Luther fed me for 20 years. And I still go back to some Lutheran things. He's got a great quote that I can't go over it off the hand right now to you, that I still use on the kind of the conclusion of my email sometimes. And I don't say it's from Luther because I'm going to get myself in trouble, but it's from him. It's from him. But it's very orthodox. It's extremely orthodox what he has to say about how this life isn't, it's not the end, it's just the beginning. And how all things are being purified now. And perfected, that this life isn't rest but exercise, and that eternally things will gleam with God's glory in the end, but we have to get through this life to do that. It's very orthodox. And there is a strain of Lutheranism in the Swedish countries, the Denmark and whatnot, that actually has an orthodox twist on some things. It's a whole strain of theologians that claim that Luther held to this very orthodox doctrine of sanctification and whatnot. But it also provides you stability in the moral world, because this world is such a place of flux and transition. And so where the world has gone today, I told my congregation that when I left it, I read to them a very pointed letter in 2007, the end of my ministry at Beavertown, that there is coming a day when this is going to happen in the Lutheran Church. And you're going to see all of this gender fluidity, you're going to see the homosexual agenda being foisted upon us. And it happened way quicker than I anticipated. Happened just a few years after I left the Lutheran Church. But I said, there's only going to be really two churches that you can go to. It's either going to be Rome or it's going to be Orthodoxy. And now I would probably revise that and say it's only Orthodoxy, because Rome's got its own set of problems, because it shares in the Protestant understanding of some things. And Protestantism is built on nothing but fragmentation. When I get my thought on something and I think you're wrong, I'll go off and start my own church, which becomes a church centered on the personality of the preacher, necessarily. And I really love the fact that Orthodoxy focuses on Christ, Jesus Christ. And the Feast of the Holy Cross, the third Sunday in Great and Holy Lent, with the cross at the center, we sometimes get, what's the word I'm looking for? Sometimes Protestants will say that we focus on the resurrection too much and not enough on the cross. But really, there's no resurrection without the cross. got to go to the cross in order to be raised. That's how it happens. You got to die to live. That's what Jesus. In fact, we just heard that gospel. We did at least at the chapel. This past Sunday. Where Peter, Jesus says, if a man wants to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, follow me. So, for me, as a Lutheran, in this mainline soup, that nobody could really agree on anything, and you knew that you were becoming more and more and more and more the minority, which wasn't always the case. I can no longer, in good conscience, continue to climb into the pulpit Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, knowing that I was very, very, very far away from the church, the mainline church, as well as many of the people sitting in the pews. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in the pew. There were many people who shared my consternation with things, but they just couldn't bring themselves to act on it. But for me, it became really a crisis of conscience. And what sealed the deal for me, that moved me from the Lutheran Church, and again, I wanted to retire before I did anything. Because I loved being a pastor, and the Lutheran Church had really fed me. In fact, the last church I had was very somewhat similar to what we experience in worship today, in that they actually used incense. And Lutheran churches didn't do that, but I said, yeah, this is a church I've been looking for all my life. Yeah. Well, what it came out to be is the Orthodox Church is a church that I've really been looking for all my life, but didn't know anything really about it because she wasn't being talked about in seminaries, at least Protestant seminaries. Or if she is talked about, she's talked about in kind of like, well, they're old sticks in the mud over there. They haven't changed in 2,000 years. Thank God that's the truth, that she has not changed in 2,000 years. So what happened in 2005, I was faced with a dilemma that I had not been faced with before. I had a young couple cohabitating who wanted to get married, and the young lady's family is one of those families that's a power family in the church. You know what I mean by that? Power family, right? They've been in church many, many, many years. Their roots go deep. So I said, I can't continue doing this game, playing this game as a Lutheran pastor. The scriptures are very clear that this is not right to do. That the marriage bed is only meant for husband and wife. And so when the young couple with her parents came in to talk to me about this, I said, I can't marry you unless you're willing to, and I thought this was a very generous offer, unless you're willing to live apart for a whole week before you get married and come to see me for confession and absolution. Now, in the Lutheran Church, confession and absolution is not a sacrament. It's a nice thing you can do if you feel the need for it. Luther taught it, but it got lost as it got translated down through the years from Luther's followers up through, which happens all the time in these Protestant variations and versions. What happens back here by the founders, by the time you get up here in the third, the fourth, the fifth generations, oftentimes it's completely different. Or there's just, they don't have the same focus as what the founders did. They would not do that. They would not accept that as a compromise. And I knew when I took my stand, and this has been brewing in me for a number of years. But I always lived with, like so many mainline pastors, I'd live with, well, at least they're getting married. Well, we'll wait till they get married and then we'll, But I said, I can't do this anymore because this is like putting the cart before the horse. This ain't right. So I took the stand, and I knew when I took the stand that it was the beginning and the end for me. I knew that. Because when you start fooling with people in power in churches, not saying that that's the way it should be, but that's what happens. you know your time limited at that point. So, and it took just about 2 years for it to finally come to completion, but that's when it started in 2005. And I refused to allow another pastor to come into my pulpit and at my altar to do the service, which didn't set well with them. And I forget exactly what all transpired, but eventually they wore me down to the point of, okay, you know, and what they did is they went to the next door down the road, a Lutheran pastor, and pleaded their case. And that pastor said, oh, you poor people, I'll do your wedding for you. You know, so this whole concept of collegiality amongst clergy, you know, that whole unity, oneness thing that I was finding in the Orthodox Church is sadly absent amongst my Lutheran colleagues. And so I finally caved in. I said, okay, I will allow this person to come in and do this wedding. But again, I knew when I did that I pretty much had sold the store at that point in time. It was just a matter of time then. But my problem was, my dilemma was, I had a bachelor's degree, pre-seminary. I have a master's divinity degree, seminary. I have a master's in holistic spirituality. That doesn't get you a whole lot on the job market. Let me tell you, folks. They're all church-oriented degrees. Because I was always going to be a pastor. I wanted to be nothing but a pastor. I had no interest in becoming a computer software programmer or a chemical engineer or an architect. I went to school to be a pastor, a shepherd. So, my dilemma was, I need a job before I can make the jump. But what do? I'm in a market that's not looking for a holistic spirituality degree, let alone for seminary degrees. And so I really had a tug of war with and I credit the Theotokos with this. She's the one who really opened wide the doors for me to be able to make the jump. I kept arguing and saying, look, you know, you've showed me the other side. There it is. There's the truth. But I can't get over there. What's up with this? This is not right. You know, you're teaching me these things, and here it is. I can't get across there. What's wrong with this? And so I remember in one of my down days, and I had a number of them, when I was trying to make this transition. You know, because I knew I couldn't hold out to retirement. I mean, I was looking at it for quite a few more years, you know, before I could even retire. And I knew that I really wasn't going to go anywhere else in the Lutheran Church because just the way the things are in that setting. So I remember going out on I think it was an October day. Went for a walk, sun was shining, skies blue, beautiful day, and I'm having this intense argument with the Theotokos. Now, I'm a Lutheran pastor, and I'm talking to the Theotokos. What's wrong with that picture? Well, it's because Orthodoxy had gotten into me. I was, praying with the saints. As a Protestant, we miss out on the fact that we are surrounded by this great witness of saints that are praying for us, and they're on our side, not just cheering for us, but they're here, present with us. We miss out on that as Protestants, on that aspect. So I said to her, you have shown me the truth, and I can't get there. This is not right. I need you to help me find work. My poor wife is caught, because she would become the breadwinner, basically, and what can we do here? So I ended up deciding, well, I'm going to go sit for this civil service exam for a caseworker, social work. I thought, maybe I can do social work. Maybe there's something in my degrees that lend themselves to that. So out of my 3 degrees, I was able to cobble this together. Now, out of 3 degrees, cobble together enough credits to satisfy the social work requirements for children youth services. And lo and behold, I had scored very high on my civil service exam. And lo and behold, in the county in which we live, Children Youth Services called me, saying, we want to interview you. So they interviewed me, and lo and behold, they offered me a job, and they offered me a job a little bit higher pay than the entry level because of my master's degrees. So I guess master's degrees do pay off. That was in November of 2007. At the end of December of 2007 is when I left the ministry. But it wasn't until with Antos and I had a long and serious conversation. And as I said, there were other times, but this one was intense. This one was, okay, we're going to do this one out together. And then the doors were thrown wide open so that I was able then to find employment. It wasn't stellar, but it was better than zip, you know. And by God's grace, my wife was able to also get some promotions in her job. She's been in the banking industry for a long time. And we actually owned our own home, which we had never owned a home before. I'd always lived in church-owned parsonages. They call them parsonages. So all these pieces started coming together. So I was the doors were thrown wide open. I was able to cross the Bosphorus. So that's kind of my journey. And if you ask me about this tomorrow, I'll probably talk to you a little bit differently because there's always a different angle to this whole thing. But what I have discovered in the Orthodoxy, as I said to you before, is the church I've been looking for all my life. It didn't really know existed. But it has fed my soul. It was feeding my soul. And what I have discovered is that Orthodoxy scratched all the other itches of my Protestant experiences. Okay? So that, and how I like to look at it is I use the image of a pie. Orthodoxy is this pie. It's the whole pie. Protestantism is a slice of that pie. So when you take that out of the pie, you're only getting a piece of the pie. And whatever is contained in that piece, whether in the Protestant tradition you come out of what's called the holiness tradition, which I have been a part of as a Wesleyan and then as a Free Methodist, or some other Pentecostal experience of speaking in tongues. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, there's that charismatic Pentecostal experience where people will speak in tongues and whatnot. There's all these variations, and that's what Protestant does. It takes the piece of the pie, and it loses the fullness of the faith, the Catholicity of the faith. Even though Lutherans like to pride themselves on being part of one Catholic and Apostolic Church, you know, but they have no concept of what that really means. And so all these Protestant experiences I found captured well by Orthodoxy and explained a lot of things that I didn't understand. And in fact, coming into Orthodoxy, I didn't have a complete, total understanding of everything coming into Orthodoxy. Because Orthodoxy is so deep that no matter what you do, you dig down and think, I finally got to, you know, and no, there's something more, and there's something more, and there's something more, and more. It's a lifelong thing. But there were things that didn't make any sense to me, like the Fantokas, for the most part, coming into Orthodoxy until I became Orthodox. And then praying with the church, living with the church, allowing the church to live in me, allowing the church to pray within me, helped me to begin to see things differently than I can think I'd really be able to understand. And I can't really remember some of the hang-ups, except with some of the Fantokas that I had with Orthodoxy coming in, you know, because they've been resolved. Or if I didn't understand something, I would say, you know, the Lord showed you this, he's brought you this far, you're going to have to trust him with this over here that you may not understand, because he didn't bring you this far to suddenly say, ah, gotcha! Sucker! It's not one of those things that God does. And I tell other persons coming into Orthodoxy from outside, from Protestantism, because we all share those concerns. Like, how can this be? This is like way too good to be true, right? You know, we've all been taught it's too good to be true. It probably isn't, you know. But Orthodoxy is. It's the fullness of the faith. It's Jesus Christ. It's his church. And we've been in existence for 2,000 years. That's a long time. It's a long time. And that doesn't always set well with my Protestant brothers and sisters, because they want to lay claim to that too. But, you know, as now that I'm able to hear, I can look back and say, well, you know, Luther's only 15, 17. So, you know, he doesn't get back far enough, you know. But we can get back to Christ and his apostles. And we can trace our roots back far back. And so, for me, that provides what I was looking for, was stability, was depth of meaning, longevity, tradition, that dirty word in Protestantism. Dirty word. But tradition, what I finally understood what tradition was. You know, one definition of tradition is it's the living faith of the Holy Spirit in the church, which is true. But tradition, when you really look at tradition, is really, this is what the church has always believed, confessed, taught, and died for. It's no different than if you're a United Methodist and you have your what's called the Book of Discipline, and you can go there and say, this is what we believe. Well, that's tradition. I don't care if you're one of those free tradition Protestants, you still have some kind of tradition, because tradition is part of the human experience. You can't escape it. It's part of it. Families have traditions. May not always be the best traditions in the world, but they're traditions nonetheless. These things bind us together, give us some kind of guidance and meaning. And the holy tradition, with a capital T, is what I found really fed me. Really fed me. You know, and I have to give Luther credit in that he would cite the church fathers in his writings, but he would pick and choose what supported his position. But he would cite the church fathers. And when the Lutherans in the 1570s reached out to Patriarch Irenaeus II, I think it was, to try to win his favor, to show that the Lutherans have not been teaching anything novel or new, but always what has been taught and believed. That those conversations and dialogues didn't go well after it was 3 years. They didn't go well. They didn't go too far. But I've often wondered what would have happened had Luther reached out to him earlier rather than later, you know, and how things might be different today. But we'll never know that at this point in time. I feel like I've been rambling, and I apologize for that. I really, truly do. As he said, you know, my story will probably completely change, you know, some angle of it. But those are some of the things that fed me, that I can think of. I guess what I would do now is entertain questions you have in your mind, you know. Or I'm sure you can ask questions of my wife. She would be glad to answer those questions. Yes, go ahead.
Could you speak more of your reasons for choosing Orthodoxy over Catholicism, and of problems shared by Protestantism and Catholicism?
Well, the long and the short of it is, I think Orthodoxy gets it right regarding the Pope. He is the first among his equals. He's always been considered the big brother, not the boss. Big brother, but not the boss. The church, for years, centuries, was governed by councils. We have 7 ecumenical councils. Not one of them was ever called by the Pope. Now, if you're the supreme leader of the church, and there's a heresy going on in your church, why are you not the one leading the charge? I don't know how Rome would answer that. You know, and Rome would send delegates, but Rome was also never the one presiding over the ecumenical councils. So I say that only as anecdotal and evidence that, so what's up with that? Why is that the case? If you are the universal leader, why are you not the one calling the ecumenical council, presiding over it? And number two, if you are the supreme leader, why do we even need an ecumenical council? You just say the word, you know, and that's it. So I really saw things from the Orthodox perspective. Now I have to be honest, Luther had the same issues, okay? But as I said, there were things much about Orthodoxy that said, yeah, you know, this is where we see some things. So the universal supremacy of the Pope was an issue. The infallibility of the Pope, you know. There's at least one Pope that was truly a heretic that got kicked out of the diptychs a long time ago. But every time, but somehow Rome, and I have many persons, former colleagues who are Roman, and I love them dearly. In fact, I pray that there will be a healing of the great schism someday. I don't know if I'll ever see it in my lifetime, but I pray for that. You know? But I don't want us to become diluted as Rome is today. And that's the other thing. Protestantism, well, there's so much going on in Protestantism. There's a loss of an understanding in Protestantism of divine revelation. God's word is divinely revealed to us. Okay. Church has always accepted that. God has spoken to us by His Son, and He has spoken through His apostles, and they've written things down, and His prophets, and they've written things down, and they've come to us. The problem is that when you accept modern biblical historical criticism, now that, when I say modern, it began in the 1800s, in a Lutheran German seminary, mind you, and it's located in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. When you adopt that mindset and you look at God's word now as simply man's words that can be ripped apart and explained away from a rational, logical viewpoint, rather than as a divine revelation, you begin to lose something. And I'm still convinced that this is one of the big issues. Is that because if you don't get taught about divine revelation in a Protestant seminary, we don't talk about that. Because once you start talking about divine revelation, then God must truly exist. And I sometimes wonder whether or not Protestants are more pragmatic atheists than anything else. And please understand me what I mean by that. You know, that God exists, and if God exists, then I got to take God seriously. You know? And then, so of course, then the Protestant response is, well, then who speaks for God? Well, the church. The church has been in existence for 2,000 years. She's preserved that. And so Rome picked up on the modern biblical historical criticism through the Jesuits. The Jesuits are always behind things. Well, that's an old Lutheran. Gotta watch its Jesuits. But when they introduced that, and what you're seeing happening in Rome today is the result of that. I'm convinced of that. Now, again, I haven't done any deep research, but just years of experience looking back and interacting with my brothers and sisters in Rome. And I do see them as brothers and sisters. But I want to say to them, come home, please, come home. So when you lose that aspect of divine revelation, everything else, I think, begins to kind of fall apart. Because whose word is it then? Is it your word? You can lead a Bible study too. You have thoughts on this matter. You can lead a Bible study. You have thoughts on this matter. Richard can. We all can. But that's what Protestantism is. So right now, 33, 40,000 different variations of what the Bible says. So in the mainline churches, divine revelation becomes. So I think that's one of the. That's why I'm saying I wouldn't want to. If we ever have a reunion and a healing that would occur, there are a lot of things that have to really be different. The Immaculate Conception of Our Lady is obviously, well, as an Orthodox Christian, is an issue. Because it's a different take on anthropology, that is how God creates man and woman. And where the Theotokos, if she's born immaculately conceived without spot or stain of sin, I think is how the Roman Catechism says, makes her really very different than the rest of us. And of course the argument is, well, if God could do it for that one person, why don't you just do it for everybody? Be done with that, So the Immaculate Conception would be an issue. Just trying to think if there's what other things in the Roman purgatory. Purgatory. I think I understand what purgatory is trying to express, but again, the old, pop the coin in the coffin from Purgatory of Soul Springs. That's a really bad rendition of the old jingle that John Tetzel, when he was selling indulgences during Luther's time, which really what sparked Luther's nailing the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg University Church door. But purgatory as a whole is certainly something that is problematic to some degree. But again, for me, the primary thing is just church history, the place of the Pope. The Pope, and yes, Rome will be able to say, well, some of your history fathers express this regarding the Pope. But again, I often find that those things are not set within the proper historical context in which they were said. So you have to kind of look at those things. But there was always a deep respect for the Pope as big brother in the family, the one you could go to if the rest of the siblings couldn't get along, but was not the boss in that regard. Does that kind of answer your question?
Today, we're seeing a split in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, we are.
The conservative bishops, mostly in the West, priests, are really causing a disturbance, and the Pope is getting ticked off, I think, at this point. I can see the conservative side joining with the Orthodox Church in some respects.
In some respects, the Latin, right. I would agree with you in that regard. Just as an aside, Pope is a Jesuit, so what can I say? But whether or not that split will occur in the Roman Church, I don't know. But again, I think that's what we're seeing the results of that long accepted biblical historical criticism of scriptures, eroding the authority and the divine revelation of God. That's why I also said that there'd be a lot of things that have to change, either with this reunion or healing. And again, I would see this healing because we are cut out of the same cloth, east and west. But we need to heal that breach at some point in time, which is a deep breach. And I think Jesus' prayer in John 17 is a great high priestly prayer. Father, make them one as you and I are one. I think is right on. There is a unity. And as much as Protestants, 40,000 different variations, want to say they're all one in Christ, my question would be, which Christ are we all one in? One who teaches eternal, security over here, John Calvin's version of Christianity, or Luther's version of Christianity, or Wesley's version of Christianity, Which Christ are we talking about? I have hopes that our more traditional brethren in our world will at least start to dialogue with us. But what I found in my rubbing shoulders with some of the Roman Catholics that I know in the area that I live in, they really don't know a whole lot about Orthodoxy, even though they have an Eastern Rite, which if you walked into an Eastern Rite of Byzantine Catholic Church, you would swear that you're getting an Orthodox service because they were Orthodox at one time, who eventually only came into union with Rome, but they were Orthodox and they used all the Orthodox stuff. The liturgy, the hours, except they commemorate the Pope, so you know they're in a different setting. But even these Roman Catholics don't know very much about their own Eastern Rite tradition, which I find very disturbing and sad at the same time, because it's such a rich tradition. In fact, Father St. Alexis of Wilkes-Barre, which he's here somewhere, he was the saint really responsible who brought back into several thousands of Uniate Christians back into fellowship with. Because as an Eastern Rite, when he was sent from the old country to, I think it was Minnesota, to minister to his flock, the Latin Rite bishop absolutely refused to do anything with him and really saw him as a second, if not third or fourth class Christian, because he was a Latin Rite, he was an Eastern Rite, whatever that is. But it is in the great turmoil, absolute turmoil, you know. So that's another reason why, because I kind of said to myself, because this was happening years ago, why do I want to go from the frying pan into the fire and have to fight the same battles all over again? What's the definition of insanity? And yet, as human beings, we do that. But it's like, yeah, why do I want to have to fight this whole battle over? Orthodoxy has fought the battle. She has maintained the course. You know, but are we going to find that every Orthodox Christian, we're all perfect? Well, if we're on to confession, there's the first clue. Jesus gave us confession because he knew we needed it. He knew we needed it. His church is perfect, but the people who make up the church were sinful, and we struggle with our passions. But God is merciful. And so that mercy of God rang true to me as a Lutheran, because we talked a lot about the mercy of God as well. But we really never talked about growing up in Jesus Christ, about maturing in the faith, about that God expects us to bear fruit. So the spirituality of the Orthodox Church is so deep. You get a taste of it in your services, especially when you go to the services. Very deep stuff. Very deep stuff. Other questions? Comments?
Did you mourn the loss of your Lutheranism once you came to Orthodoxy?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I praise God for having received me in Orthodox, that he found me worthy. And by the way, when I came to Orthodoxy, there was no guarantee that I would ever be a pastor again. None whatsoever. Okay? You need to be clear about that. It's all up to the bishop and the Holy Synod. So there was no guarantee. And from that, I even talked about the mission that got started in my house. You know, in Beavertown, we were a house church, just like in the Book of Acts, for a number of years. From 2008 to 2015, when we finally had our original church building built, and then in 2020 had the altar on. So if you're ever down my way, please come visit us. We'd love to have you. But I mourned certain things. I think sometimes when I couldn't quite get my handle on things as an Orthodox, doing some of the liturgies, getting some of the things set up, because the beautiful thing about the Western mindset, and that mindset, an Orthodox mindset, you have to form an Orthodox mindset because the Western mindset doesn't work. And the Western mindset is very academic, very rational, very logical, very ordered. That's some of the problems I have with Rome. Okay? But what I really like is that if I want to know how to do a certain service in the church, I walked over to my bookshelf, picked up the handbook of how to do services, and then opened it up and found exactly how I was to do the service. You don't find that in Orthodoxy, and that is maddening. Maddening. For those of us coming out of that Western tradition, it kind of like got spoiled, if you will. So there's a part of that I don't know if I would say it more in it, but I miss that piece, that easiness, because I always feel like I'm not quite sure, and then how stupid I feel sometimes, because I'm not sure about this, But I found this great latitude in Orthodoxy too, which I'm discovering more and more. That the reason there may not be a manual is because there are a multitude of ways that you can do a service. There's not just a right way. And in the Western mindset, you have to do things right, and it has to be prim and proper in order, at least in the liturgical churches, like the Lutheran Church, Episcopal Church, and some Presbyterian churches. I know there was times as a Lutheran pastor, I would be standing there going, okay, I know that I made a mistake, so how do I rectify this? Or I left something over there that I need to get, but I just can't walk over there and pick it up because I gotta look like it's gotta be part of what I'm doing. In Orthodoxy, now it's like, okay, I'll go get it. And not that I'm doing it lazily or with haphazardly, but I'm doing it without feeling like I'm making a huge mistake. Orthodoxy, it's not magic. You don't have to say this certain incantations just right in order for things to happen. So you kind of get that sense sometimes in the Western mindset. Some of the things I celebrate, though, and I still do, is I like to sing the hymns. There's some hymns that are just very, very... Hymnody is a very powerful thing in the Protestant Church. That's how Luther was able to win the day with the Reformation, is by his hymnody. By taking secular tunes, if you want to call them, and applying them to sacred music, and he was able to do that. Luther often said that while he and Melanchthon, his sidekick, Luther was the polemicist, Melanchthon was the Irenicist. He was the guy who was peaceful, trying to figure out how to make everybody happy, find common ground, Luther, he was just like a cat in a cat fight. But he often say that while we sat in the tavern drinking beer, the Holy Spirit was the one doing the work. Which, I can get into that, I can understand that. So there are some things that I miss, but I have to be honest, I don't miss the Western liturgy anymore. In fact, when I go into a church that serves Western liturgy, and this is one reason why I can become a Western Rite Orthodox, is I find it so blasé, so lacking depth. And I don't know, I was in love with the liturgy. I was a high churchman, in the Protestant world. I was a high churchman, so I wore vestments. And as I said, in my last church, we used incense, though. A lot of people go, the incense. The psychological thing. But I don't miss that anymore. I don't miss that. Because I think I found everything I've been looking for in Orthodox. But I have to say that when I find myself singing the Protestant hymns, and there are Protestant hymns I do like to sing, For All the Saints. I love that hymn. We would sing oftentimes at funerals, I find myself singing them, but I find that I understand them very differently now. That there's a new meaning, a deeper meaning attached to it now. In fact, Father Peter Gilchrist of blessed memory had received a blessing from his bishop, I think it was Philip, that he and his family would gather Sunday evenings around their old piano, and they would just do a family hymn sing. To sing the old Protestant hymns because it fed them spiritually. There's a great depth. The Christmas, I'm constantly humming Christmas tunes. I love Christmas music. there's great truth, you know. And so not everything Protestant is heretical or even systematic, but you have to know your theology and the tradition of the church in order to soak through that. So I find that it feeds me. It feeds me. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, did it justice. I would never want to go back. As Father John, blessed memory, would often say, I would rather spend one day in the Orthodox Church, even with all the problems that maybe get manifested, because remember, we're all human beings, right? And we're not without our issues. Okay? But I said, I'd rather spend one day in the Orthodox Church, knowing that it's Christ's church, than an entire lifetime in the Protestant world. And that doesn't make me better than Protestants. It just makes me, I need to be more humble. I need to be giving God thanks. I need to be doing what God has called me to do as a servant. I said to my congregation the other day that one of my favorite passages is out of Luke 17, where, and I can't remember the exact quote anymore, but at the end of the day, well, Jesus talks about how a servant will sit down and serve the master. It's only after the master has been served that the servant then gets to sit down and meal. You know, and the response is, I am not a servant, I have only done my duty. I am God's servant, I am your servant. And my task is to do my duty, insofar as God has given me that duty as a shepherd to do that. You know? And that's what I want on my tombstone. You know, I've only been a servant. I've done my duty. Hopefully, I've done my duty faithfully and obediently. So Orthodoxy kind of just answered all that for me, so I'm very content. And I get worried about persons coming into the Orthodox Church from outside, from the Protestant world, because so often it's like, wow, this is the Church of Christ, and it's been here, and no one told me about it, and then something happens, and it's like, the balloon gets deflated. Well, I try to remember, I try to remind folks, read 1 Corinthians. And that's the Orthodox Church that Paul was talking to that was doing incestuous stuff that he had to call them out on, you know, and some other stuff that wasn't right. That's the Church of Christ in 1 Corinthians. It's Christ's church, you know. So don't be surprised sometimes if these things rear their heads, you know, because the Bible's already dealt with this, but it's Christ's church. Bought and paid for by the blood of the Lamb. Anything else? Anyone else? Has this been helpful at all for you?
Yes. And we're glad you're here.
I'm glad you're here too. So
We're glad you made the switch.
All right. Anything else? Because I'm assuming it's probably about 8 o'clock or so. Oh, is it? Oh my, I'm sorry. I'm meeting with you folks tomorrow. Okay, at the hub.
Yeah.
Father Ignatius said he would walk me down there, so we'll try to find him.
Are you working on a show?
You gotta work.
She's got to work. She's got to work. So just be me. Sorry, folks. Just me.
And the group
Next
is-
time, invite me again.
You're good, I'm good with you.
Sure. I can get a picture. And we can talk about some other things, or pick up on what you know. We may have some questions here. I can reflect on some things. Thank you for setting the trees up, Richard. Appreciate that. So where are we doing?
I'm thinking back to like
I think we need better looking like it.
Come on, Richard, you get in there.
No.
Richard, you the seniors. What do they say?
That's
Super
okay.
senior.
That's
Yeah, come on, get on.
just you. Yeah, just say, Richard.
All right.
No,
No,
I
I
You guys will be at Bloomsburg, right?
I'll be there probably like